way. And there are so many implications of high levels of immigration. We heard it earlier from Paul Morland and Christian Niemitz. But I deliberately didn't talk about the impact on housing because my next guest in the studio is a housing expert, one Russell Quirk, property and housing expert. Russell, very good evening. Thanks for being on the show. Now, these numbers, firstly, were you shocked by these?
What, the net migration numbers?
Net migration, and indeed the gross numbers.
Well, yes, I was, but also the fact that they had to be revised.
Yes.
Of course, that there was a little bit of stealth gone on in previous years by the looks of it.
Like by 20%,
yes.
Not just a few percent.
Yes.
They seem to have changed the methodology.
Yes, it's huge, and obviously, not just from a housing perspective, but from the point of view of all resources, completely and utterly unsustainable.
And so let's just look at housing, because clearly, we know that basically, the cost of renting has gone through the roof.
Yeah.
You've got the usual sort of economic factors of demand and supply. And we've got a graph here, which you'll remember earlier in the show, had the graph of the immigration numbers, which is the blue line on this graphic. Now, Russell, the red line, and this is since 1964 to now, the red line on this graph is the housing completions during that same period. So you've got net immigration soaring in recent years, and you've got a collapse in housing numbers. So
yes. So we've got both graphs going the wrong way. So we have net migration increasing substantially, as you can see from the graph. From the point of view of housing supply, so the provision of new homes, whether that's sale or rental, because it all comes out of the same pot effectively, what we've actually seen in real terms is a halving, so 50% reduction in housing provision since the 1960s. So in the days of the Macmillan government and during the 60s and 70s, typically about 300,000 new homes were built and produced in Britain every year. Now, over the last 13 years, so since the start of this particular government, it's only 168,000 homes. And I have to say to you, Labour, not that much better. So before the Labour supporters start crowing and saying, we'll be much, much better when we get in next year. No, they won't, because their average is only 180,000 homes per year versus their own self-imposed targets of 300,000 a year.
Sir Keir Starmer has promised
Build.
He's promised he'll build 1.5 million in 5 years, so that's 300,000 a year.
Yeah.
When did we last build 300,000 homes in this country?
In the 1960s.
In the 1960s?
Yeah, and if Keir Starmer manages to do that, I will eat my shoes, Richard.
Remember that, folks? You heard it here first. Russell has promised to eat his shoes if in the next 5 years we build 300,000 homes.
It's simply not going to happen.
I agree with you. I think that's very unlikely. I promised last week to eat my hat on something else. I'm not going to promise to eat anything else. But here's the thing. We're not going to build 300,000 a year. These numbers are going through the roof. So what does that mean? Does it basically mean rents are going up and up?
Well, everything's going up. So if you look at house prices, house prices are up, despite the recent dip, by about 20% since just before the pandemic. So 20% just in the last 3 or 4 years. We've seen an incredible increase in house values, both for sale and for rental, simply because of the shortage of supply versus demand. There have been multiple studies that say that immigration alone over the last 20 years or so has added about 20% to house prices, just immigration alone. So
that graphic that showed the housing completions against the immigration, you can see that actually pre-1990 you had far more houses being built, and therefore you didn't have this huge price growth, and therefore the impact for young people actually they suffer the most. It's ever harder to get on the housing ladder, and I guess essentially people's become more cramped. More people have to live in the same homes, the same dwellings,
particularly
essentially sort of to bunk up in order to be able to live.
Yeah, so there was some mitigation in recent years with interest rates being ridiculously low, but now they've gone back to what I would call normal levels. And by the way, 5% interest rates are not high by historic standards. Now interest rates have gone back to normal levels. Of course, there is no more that mitigation. So for first-time buyers, it's getting harder and harder. But to the point in terms of how those houses get built. And it's not just Keir Starmer and, previous prime ministers of all political flavours that have just literally licked a finger and stuck it in the air and said, we are going to build this many houses. Well, it's nothing but wishful thinking and rhetoric. The reason they won't, frankly, is because the contrast now between where we are today on house building in the 1960s is two things. First of all, we used to build lots and lots of council houses back in the 1960s and 70s. Yep. So about half those 300,000 homes were social homes that were needed. But the other reason is that we are now, whether we like it or not, and I say this as a huge capitalist, by the way, before anybody starts telling me off for being a socialist, we are in the hands, in terms of housing supply, of just 10 PLC house builders. They now control almost all new builds being built.
Some would say, well, we need to get a grip and we need to ease the planning regulations, and it'd be great for the economy if we built 300,000 or 400,000 a year.
It's not
fantastic.
It's a misnomer to say it's the planning process. So the difference between those planning permissions granted over 10 years and the houses actually built is huge. There's a huge gap, a bit like your graph there, insofar as planning consents versus what's built.
So you're blaming the developers?
I'm blaming the house builders. I don't blame them, because if they are working to the behest of their shareholders, I don't blame them. That's their job. But their job.
So might a Labour government say, well, actually, we're going to borrow more money.
How are they going to do it?
Or print more money, and they might say, we're just going to build 150,000 council homes on government-owned land.
And I wish they would. But the problem is governments and local authorities don't know how to build houses. They're not developers. It's wishful thinking. It's easy to say. And frankly, look, it's... If you don't do something about the stranglehold of those top 10 house builders who have no social...
They've got no
social responsibility.
No, absolutely. Well, that's a good point. We will come back to that. Russell Quirk, thank you so much indeed for sharing your expertise and knowledge on that. He knows a thing or two.